Warren Buffett is arguably one of the greatest investors of all time, and many of Berkshire's shareholders have become millionaires thanks to his value investing strategy. Because if you had invested $1,000 into the S&P 500 back in 1965, you'd now have around $244,000 today. But if you had invested those $1,000 into Berkshire Hathaway instead, you'd now have over $38 million. That's more than a 3.8 million% return on your investment. But what did Warren Buffett do to achieve such an outstanding performance? Here are 5 of Warren Buffett's principles that are key to his investing strategy. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. By the way, if you want to learn more about Warren Buffett's investing, the How to Invest Like Warren Buffett course dives into a detailed analysis of his techniques. It's a data analysis looking at the number of stocks he bought in each industries over the years, how he used the Buffett indicator, and other never before seen insights into his investing. It also uses case studies of his most successful stocks like American Express, Coca-Cola, Apple, and more to try and understand his decision making. Click the link in bio to get a free preview today. Number 1, buying businesses, not stocks.
Imagine for a moment that you decided to invest money now and you bought a farm. And the farmland around here, let's say you bought 160 acres and you bought it at X per acre. And the farmer next to you had 160 identical acres, same contour. It was identical. And that farmer next door to you was a very peculiar character because every day that farmer with the identical farm said, I'll sell you my farm or I'll buy your farm at a certain price, which he would name. Now, that's a very obliging neighbor. I mean, that's got to be a plus to have a fellow like that with the next farm. You don't get that with farms. You get it with stocks. If you own 100 shares of General Motors, on Monday morning, somebody will buy your 100 shares or sell you another 100 shares at exactly the same price, and that goes on 5 days a week. But just imagine if you had a farmer doing that. When you bought the farm, you looked to what the farm would produce. That was what went through your mind. You were saying to yourself, I'm paying X dollars per acre. I think I'll get so many bushels of corn or soybeans on average. Some years good, some years bad. Some years the price will be good, some years the price will be bad, etc. But you think about the potential of the farm. And now you get this idiot that buys the farm next to you, and on top of that, he's sort of a manic depressive and drinks, maybe smokes a little pot. So his numbers just go all over the place. The only thing you have to do is to remember that this guy next door is there to serve you and not to instruct you. You bought the farm because you thought the farm had the potential. You don't really need a quote on it. If you bought in with John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie, and there were never any quotes. Well, there were quotes later on, but basically you bought into the business, and that's what you're doing when you buy stocks. But you get this added advantage that you do have this neighbor who you're not obliged to listen to at all, who is going to give you a price every day, and he's going to have his ups and downs, and maybe he'll name a selling price that he'll buy at, in which case you sell if you want to. Or maybe he'll name a very low price and you'll buy his farm from him. But you don't have to. And you don't want to put yourself in a position to where you have to. So stocks have this enormous inherent advantage of people yelling out prices all the time to you. And many people turn that into a disadvantage. And of course, many people profit in one way or another from telling you that they can tell you what this farmer's going to yell out tomorrow or your neighboring farmer's going to yell out tomorrow or next week or next month. There's huge money in it. So people tell you that it's important and they know, and that you should pay a lot of attention to their thoughts about what price changes should be, or you tell yourself that there should be this great difference. But the truth is, if you owned the businesses you liked prior to the virus arriving, it changes prices and it changes, but nobody's forcing you to sell. And if you really like the business and you like the management you're in with, and the business hasn't fundamentally changed, and I'll get to that a little when I report on Berkshire, the stocks have an enormous advantage, and you still can bet on America. But you can't bet unless you're willing and have an outlook to independently decide that you want to own a cross-section of America, because I don't think most people are in a position to pick single stocks. A few may be, but on balance, I think people are much better off buying a cross-section of America and just forgetting about it. If I'd done that when I got out of college, it's all I had to do to make 100 for one, and then collect dividends on top of it, which would increase substantially over time. The American tailwind is marvelous. American business represents, and it's going to have interruptions, and you're not going to foresee the interruptions, and you do not want to get yourself in a position where those interruptions can affect you, either because you're leveraged or because you're psychologically unable to handle looking at a bunch of numbers. If you really had a farm and you had this neighbor, and one day he offered you $2,000 an acre, and the next day he offers you $1,200 an acre, and maybe the day after that he offers you $800 an acre, are you really going to feel that at $2,000 an acre, when you had evaluated what the farm would produce, are you going to let this guy drive you into thinking I better sell because his number keeps coming in lower all the time? It's a very, very, very important matter to bring the right psychological approach to owning common stocks. But I will tell you, if you bet on America and sustain that position for decades, you're going to do better than, in my view, far better than owning Treasury securities, or far better than following people who tell you that what the farmer's going to yell out next. There's huge amounts of money that people pay for advice they really don't need.
2, looking for companies with economic moats or competitive advantages that can be maintained.
We try to, we try to follow Ben's principles in terms of the attitude we bring toward both investing and in buying businesses. But the most important thing what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a business with a wide and long-lasting moat around it, protecting a terrific economic castle with an honest lord in charge of the castle. And in essence, that's what business is all about. I mean, you may want to be the lord of the castle yourself, in which case you don't worry about that last factor. But what we're trying to find is a business for one reason or another. It can be because it's the low-cost producer in some area. It can be because it has a natural franchise, because of service capabilities. It could be because of its position in the consumer's mind. It can be because of a technological advantage, or any kind of reason at all that it has this moat around it. And then what we have to decide is all moats are subject to attack in a capitalistic system. So everybody is going to try. If you've got a big castle in there, people are going to be trying to figure out how to get to it. And what we have to decide, and most moats aren't worth a damn in capitalism. I mean, that's the nature of it, and it's a constructive thing that's the case. But we are trying to figure out why is that castle still standing, and what's going to keep it standing or cause it not to be standing 5, 10, 20 years from now. What are the key factors, and how permanent are they? How much do they depend on the genius of the lord in the castle? And then if we feel good about the moat, then we try to figure out whether the Lord is going to try and take it all for himself, or whether he's likely to do something stupid with the proceeds, etc. But that's the way we look at businesses.
3, focusing on long-term intrinsic value, not short-term earnings.
Actually, Graham didn't get too specific about intrinsic value in terms of precise calculations, but intrinsic value has come to be equated with, and I think quite properly, with what you might call private business value. Now, the intrinsic value of any business, if you could foresee the future perfectly, is the present value of all cash that will be ever distributed for that business between now and Judgment Day. And we're not perfect at estimating that, obviously, but that's what an investment or a business is all about. You put money in and you take money out. Aesop said a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Now, he said that around 600 BC or something like that, but that hasn't been improved on very much by the business professors now. Now, the question is, how sure are you that there are 2 in the bush? How far away is the bush? There are all kinds of things. What are interest rates? But, Aesop wanted to leave us something to play with over the next couple thousand years, so he didn't spell the whole thing out. But that's what intrinsic value essentially is. And Graham would say that. Phil Fisher would say that. Phil Fisher would say that in calculating that, he would want to look a lot harder at the qualitative factors of the business in making that estimate of how many birds were in the bush. Graham would say he would want to see the bush, $2 worth of cash in the bush, and to pay $1 for it now. And one emphasized quantitative factors and one emphasized qualitative factors, but neither one would have disagreed with the math. And I started out very influenced by Graham, so I emphasized quantitative factors. Charlie came along and said I was all wrong, and that he'd learned more in law than I'd learned in financial studies and everything, and that I should think more about qualitative factors, and he was right. And Phil Fisher said the same thing. But that's what intrinsic value is about. If you buy a McDonald's franchise, if you buy General Motors, whatever it may be, the real question is, A, are you going to have to put more cash into it after you buy it? But it's really cash in, cash out, when, what discount rate, all the standard stuff.
4, demanding a margin of safety.
You calculate, I think you take all of the variables and calculate them reasonably conservatively, but you don't try and put too much windage in at every level. And then when you get all through, you apply the margin of safety. So I would say don't focus too much on taking it on each variable in terms of the discount rate and the growth rate and so on, but try to be as realistic as you can on those numbers, but with any errors being on the conservative side. And then when you get all through, you apply the margin of safety. Ben Graham had a very simple formula he used for just the most obvious situations, which was to take working capital, net working capital, and try and buy it at a third off working capital. And overall that worked for him, but that method sort of ran out of steam when the sub-working capital stocks disappeared. But it's the same thing we do in insurance. I mean, if we're trying to figure out what we should charge for, we'll just say, the chances of a 6.0 earthquake in California. Well, we know that in the last century, I think there have been 26 or so 6.0 or greater quakes in California. And let's forget about whether they occur in remote areas. Let's just say we were writing a policy that paid off on a 6.0 or greater quake in California, regardless of whether it occurred in a desert and did no damage or anything. Well, we would look at the history and we'd say, well, there have been 26 in the last century, and we would probably assume a little higher number in the next century. That'd just be our nature. But we wouldn't assume 50. If we did, we wouldn't write any business. So we might assume a little higher. If I was pricing it myself, I'd probably say, well, I'll assume they're going to be 30 or maybe 32 or something like that. Then when I get all through, I'll want to put a premium on it that now puts in a margin of safety. In other words, if I figured the proper rate for 32 is $1 million, I would probably want to charge something more than $1 million to build in that margin of safety. But I don't want to hit it at. I want to be conservative at all the levels, and then I want to have that significant margin of safety at the end.
5, being patient.
In the securities business, you literally every day have thousands of the major American corporations offered to you at a price that changes daily. And you don't have to make any decisions. You have to make, nothing is forced upon you. So there are no called strikes in the business. The pitcher just stands there and throws balls at you. And if you're playing real baseball and it's between the knees and the shoulders, you either swing or you get a strike called on you. If you get too many called on you, you're out. In the securities business, you sit there and they throw U.S. Steel at 25, and they throw General Motors at 68, and you don't have to swing at any of them. They may be wonderful pitches to swing at, but if you don't know enough, you don't have to swing. And you can sit there and watch thousands of pitches, and finally you get one right there where you want it, something that you understand, and then you swing. And
so you might not swing for 6 months.
You might not swing for 2 years.
Isn't that boring?
It would bore most people, and certainly boredom is a problem with most professional money managers. If they try to sit out an inning or two, not only do they get somewhat antsy, but their clients start yelling, "Swing, you bum!" from the stands, and that's very tough for people to do.
Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more.